we go online. Hilter, tú me avisas. Ya. Make refresh, maybe, Hilter. Dear all, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Howard World Heritage 2021 debates and the month dedicated to impact of disaster and pandemics on World Heritage sites. I'm Humberto Bonomo, Director of Cultural Heritage Center at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And with Fernando Pérez, Karen Gole, Yolanda Muñoz, and Hilter González, we have planned this seminar, one more seminar that closed today, the third week, that bring us profound knowledge accumulated from around the world on how pandemics and natural disasters have affected and continue affecting our World Heritage sites. The speaker of this session, we kindly share different case studies, experiences, and lessons, allowing us to obtain a better context related to the recent situation and state of health of our World Heritage. Throughout this month, we have planned and organized more than 20 sessions and conversation, a collective effort of more than 100 people, some of which are from the most remote areas of the globe, as today Chris Ballard from Australia, for example, in the late Friday. I will also like to thank all the coordinator of each of the session and the presenters who will accompany us throughout the month. For those who don't know the Howard World Heritage Foundation, it seems relevant to me to recall our goals. The purpose of the foundation is to promote heritage protection, conservation, and management, to support knowledge-based decision-making, to promote good governance of the World Heritage Convention, and to engage and empower civil society in heritage protection and management. Having said this, I will introduce the theme of the month, sharing with you a short video that explains how disaster and pandemics have affected the world.
Recent disasters and an actual pandemic have exposed the fragility and vulnerability of our world heritage. These exceptional sites and pieces, which we would like to preserve for all humanity and future generations, do not exist in a segregated world. They belong to our social environment and our daily life. But at the same time, the World Heritage Sites are in danger. They are threatened by natural hazards that attempt against their existence. The pandemic has revealed their fragility and how much the human presence in them is vital and necessary for their survival. How can we protect them and at the same time give them life and new meanings? If we hope for a future for them, we should stop considering them only as beautiful objects or places, merchandise for the tourist industry, and fully integrate them into the social and cultural dynamics of daily life. We propose to promote a great discussion around the world on the risks and effects of disasters and pandemics on World Heritage Sites. We invite non-governmental organizations, academies, representatives of civil society, and local governments to participate, to contribute with new proposals for public policies on the conservation and safeguarding of the cultural and natural heritage of humanity.
Today's session is Intangible Heritage and Disasters, and it's moderated by Alejandra Alburne, PhD of Oxford University and Assistant Professor of Sustainable Heritage in University College of London, Institute for Sustainable Heritage. A structural engineer, she has worked on heritage preservation and traditional construction methods. Also, she has been involved in research on the seismic behavior of traditional structures, and he is interested in how affordable, durable housing and recovery of cultural heritage can positively impact the resilience of community. Alejandra, thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Humberto, for the introduction to our World Heritage, to this month's theme, and to today's seminar as well. It is my pleasure to bring to you an exciting range of speakers from across the world who will be presenting, I'm sure, very engaging and very deeply interesting case studies that bring you experiences of intangible heritage in the context of disasters. Let me share my screen for a second, and I will introduce the program for today. So the aims of today's seminar is to present experiences of how the world's intangible cultural heritage is affected by different disasters. And this includes also, this includes the broadest definition of disasters, also considering current issues like the COVID-19 pandemic or the current climate crisis. And then the second aim is to also present experiences of what the role of intangible heritage can be on recovery processes in these disasters. The program for the session is the following. We have 5 presenters today. We have Chris Ballard from Oceania, who will be presenting a case from Vanuatu, Disaster as Opportunity, Reintegrating Intangible Cultural Heritage and World Heritage in the Aftermath of Cyclone Pan. We don't actually have Mona Lisa Mahajan joining us today because unfortunately she isn't well, but she has submitted an abridged presentation that I will be delivering to you to present her work on the role of intangible heritage in resilience building and recovery processes in post-2015 Nepal. We are joined by Naila Saadi, representing Africa from the University of Tunis, who will be talking about climate change and Berber intangible heritage in the south of Tunisia. We then will be joined by Cody Grode, who represents North and Central America and will be talking about intangible cultural heritage, indigenous stewardship, and the climate crisis. And finally, Catalina Ortiz will be joining us in representation of South America to talk about a Living Heritage Atlas, Pandemic Co-Creation Processes in Medellin. After the presentations, there will be time for a panel discussion. And I really encourage everybody to contribute with questions and with experiences of their own as well. Without further ado, I would like to invite Chris Ballard to take the floor. So Chris, if you want to get ready, and in the meantime, perfect. Sure. Yeah, I can see. Thanks. So let me introduce Chris to you. Chris is an associate professor in Pacific History at the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. His current research interests in indigenous historicity, cultural transmission, living heritage, and transdisciplinary approaches to the genesis of cultural diversity draw on and reflect long-term collaborative engagement with communities in Papua New Guinea, West Papua and Vanuatu. Recent books and journal special issues include Confronting the Naturalness of Disaster in the Pacific, Rough Justice, Punitive Expeditions in Oceania, and Foreign Bodies, Oceania and the Science of Race, 1750 to 1940. Thank you very much for joining us today, Chris, and over to you.
Thanks indeed, Alejandra. And greetings to everyone from Canberra, Australia, which is the unceded land of the First Nations people, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri. So I start by paying my respects to their elders and to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So I want to talk today just very briefly about the idea that disaster might present a kind of opportunity, particularly for intangible cultural heritage, an opportunity to rethink both how we imagine the transmission of ICH, but also an opportunity often for ICH practitioners to rethink their own practices, revise them and renew them. So in most instances, let me just minimize that. Disaster and culture are mutually constituted. What do I mean by that? Both that disasters are culturally and socially defined. We know that well enough. No, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. But also that disasters are woven into the development of most cultures. There's been a shift in discourse over the last 10 years in particular on heritage risk from tangible to intangible properties, to thinking about the way in which disasters both impact on ICH and ICH plays this dual role then of mitigating the impacts of disaster. But a strange thing is that this emphasis in much ICH discourse on documentation or inventorying and protection or safeguarding has not been matched by comparable investment and understanding ICH transmission in a dynamic mode. And this failure to grasp transmission restricts our analysis of the likely impact of disaster on ICH and the role of ICH in learning from and mitigating disaster. There's a scope, I think, for what we call the disaster biography approach, either focusing on the life history of a single disaster event and its impact on a range of ICH, or on the life history through multiple disasters of a single ICH practice or element. So Vanuatu in the South Pacific is consistently ranked #1 as the country most at risk of disaster by the World Risk Index, and that reflects both the fact that it has almost every kind of natural hazard, cyclone, earthquake, tsunami, and so on, everything except frost, and also a fairly limited capacity on the part of the state to deliver aid and services. But that ranking is not reflected at all in mortality from natural hazards, and even the largest cyclones rarely see more than 10 people dying. So what we think is that the role of ICH or local knowledge and the role of community resilience is massively underestimated in that World Risk Index. So how might we say that cultural heritage is at risk from disaster in a country such as Vanuatu? And a recent review we've done suggests that it's the unnatural disasters, if you like, of colonialism, epidemics, land loss, depopulation, and religious conversion that have been much more threatening over time to cultural transmission and to lives than the natural hazard disasters. So this World Heritage Site, Vanuatu's first World Heritage Site of Chief Roy Matas Domain. It's a cultural landscape organized around stories and archaeological sites that are related to the life and death and burial of a 16th century paramount chief, Roy Mata. And it features 3 key sites: his settlement, the cave in which he died, and his burial with anywhere between 50 and 300 people who voluntarily went to their death on this small island together with him. It was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2008. It is entirely owned and managed by the indigenous Lelema community. I still think that may be the only World Heritage Site in the world for which that is true. I know Rapa Nui has recently been returned to indigenous custodians, but it's not true for many World Heritage Sites. Now, that site was hit by a Category 5 cyclone, Tropical Cyclone Pam, in March of 2015, with winds gusting over 300 kilometers an hour. Over the entire country, 11 people were killed, 17,000 buildings destroyed, and 65,000 people displaced, about 20% of the population. The damage was equivalent to 64% of GDP. So you can see this disjunct between the economic damage relative to the country's wealth and the relatively diminished, if still tragic, death toll. At that World Heritage Site of Chief Roy Mutter's domain, it was the first major natural hazard event since inscription. Most of the modern infrastructure was destroyed or damaged, but it was fascinating to see that the traditional sites, positioned over centuries and indeed thousands of years very carefully with cyclones in mind, were largely untouched. Equipped with the first emergency assistance grant to a Pacific World Heritage Site, we then re-engaged with a community that we've been involved with for about 25 years to talk about this disaster and to be engaged in this process, both of restoration of the sites and their reconsecration by the senior chief. So what does Cyclone Pam, what does a major Category 5 disaster mean for ICH safeguarding in somewhere like Vanuatu? What we found was that the cyclone was a watershed moment for reflection on failures in the transmission of cyclone-related practices. And that led to broader conversations about cultural transmission and about the revival or the revision of certain practices. As one of the local community members, Max Calson, said, Cyclone Pam brought with it great winds, but also opportunities. So disasters in Vanuatu are moments of cultural reckoning, renewal, and rethinking. They are watersheds in the process of transmission. The challenge for us is modeling this relationship over time between cultural knowledge and disasters. And one thing that's very evident is that disaster mitigation knowledge, that aspect of ICH, is a really complex domain of knowledge. It's distributed and dispersed across multiple other domains of knowledge, such as subsistence, house building, weather, and so on. It's very seldom brought together or invoked or referred to as a discrete body of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. If anyone in the audience has questions for Chris, please save them for later. We will take questions during the panel discussion at the end. I would like to move on to Mona Lisa Mahajan's presentation. As I mentioned, she's unable to join us today because of health reasons, but she sent through a summary of her presentation on the poll that I would like to read out to you. So first of all, let me introduce Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa Mahajan has a PhD in art history from the University of Edinburgh. Her dissertation discussed linking tangible and intangible heritage with a case study of Yenyap Funti Festival in Nepal. She has experience of working in different intangible cultural heritage related projects. She's also a team member of the UNESCO Chair in Intangible Cultural Heritage and Traditional Know-How, which is based in Portugal. She currently works in the Anthropology of Inscriptions project at Heidelberg University through the Nepal Heritage Documentation Project. Her research interests are in community participation, indigenous heritage, sustainable heritage, and documentation of ICH. I'm going to share some images that Mona Lisa has sent me. As I mentioned earlier, her presentation is entitled The Role of Intangible Heritage in Resilience Building and Recovery Processes in Post-2015 Nepal. Intangible heritage might look fragile and prone to disappearance any time, but in the time of disaster, it has stood as a solid foundation and contributed in the moral support of the people. In the devastating earthquake of 2015 in the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal, intangible cultural heritage became the symbol of resilience. Many festivals, rituals, processions, traditional practices, and mass dances that are an important part of everyday life continued despite the fragile structures and trembling ground. This presentation will be based on examples from the 2015 earthquake and the intangible cultural heritage activities within the Kathmandu Valley. Intangible cultural heritage of Nepal. Kathmandu Valley has festivals, rituals, processions, mass dances, and so on all around the year. These are events not just for entertainment or formalities, but are important in the social life of the people. Strengthening the family ties and integration in the family also depend on invitation for these types of events. Most of the practices, rituals, and festivals are still organized by the social organization known as Guti. These Guti have been present since the 5th century. Chariot processions, taking care of temples, rituals, or organizing mass dances are all done by these traditional Gutis. Gutis had land endowment to continue the rituals and take care of the monuments. However, after the land reform, all Guti land went under the direct control of the government of Nepal, and the organization called Guti Sanstam started to provide money and materials for organizing events. But the work is still being done by the traditional Guti, who complain that the money provided by Guti Sanstam is not enough, as they continue to provide the same amount they used to give 40 years ago. Earthquakes are very frequent in Nepal, with a major event occurring every 80 to 100 years. In 2015, the earthquake was of 2.8 magnitude. The previous high-severity earthquake was in 1934, which had a magnitude of 8.2. The 2015 earthquake did an immense damage to the monuments of the Kathmandu Valley, but also to the valley's intangible cultural heritage. As mentioned earlier, intangible cultural heritage is an integral part of people's everyday life in Nepal. Even when the monuments and houses were in ruins after the earthquakes, many festivals and rituals continued as in previous years. The longest chariot procession of God Karunamaya in the city of Patan, which was taking place during the earthquake, did not stop. According to the chariot makers, they even remade the damaged chariot and completed the procession. Similarly, other festivals which followed, this is an image of one of the chariot processions. Similarly, other festivals which followed in the next few years continued in other cities as well. While the houses and monuments were in ruins as a result of the earthquake, the chariot processions, mass dances, rituals, and festivities all continued. People believe that these festivals, rituals, and events are related to the well-being of the people and the country as a whole. Nepalese people still believe that if they don't continue these traditions, there could be bad consequences. Even though the festivals were not merry after the earthquakes as they were in previous years, for the formality, these rituals and events were continued. All these festivals are public events, and they take place in open squares, streets, and raised platforms. We could see the damaged monuments in the backdrop where the events were taking place. This intangible heritage provided hope and something to look forward to for the devastated people and the place. I know Mona Lisa is very sorry that she can't join us today, but I'm very pleased that she was able to share with us this condensed insight into this exciting topic that she's been researching. At this stage, I would like to invite our next speaker to the floor. I would like to invite Naila Saadi to join us. Naila, if you would like to get ready. I will introduce you in the meantime. Naila Saadi holds a PhD in Heritage Science from the University of Tunis. She is assistant professor in the High Institute of Heritage Trades, which is part of the University of Tunis. Her dissertation focused on the heritage policy in both colonial and independent period Indonesia, based on the example of Berber heritage. Naila, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is over to you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you for inviting me to this session. So I'm pleased to be with you, to be with all of you today. And it's okay. Okay. So what I propose to present today is the impact of climate change on Berber and tangible heritage in Tunisia, and especially in the region of the Southeast. So I will start by a quick presentation of this heritage. So Berber or Amazigh, I'm using the two terms as synonyms, are considered as the original and autochthonous cultural group of the country and in North Africa. In Tunisia, there are many elements that bear witness to the extent of this heritage. This allows us to reconstruct the main feature of this heritage going back to the proto-history. Troglodytism and graphic symbols are the main features of this heritage. Megalithic monuments, funeral furniture, rock painting are part of this heritage and attest to its autochthony and permanence. Today, it is the region of, so this is the map of Tunisia. So today is the southeastern region of Tunisia, which is more known as representing the tangible and intangible heritage of the Berber, and which could be limited as follows. So we have the three big parts of what is the tangible heritage. So the vertical troglodyte zone, which correspond to Jebel Matmata and which represent a rather unique form of construction in the country and in the region. The Persian village area, but also found in the north of the country as Takruna Jad, which confirms the penchant for the occupation of inaccessible sites, often hilly sites. The zone of the horizontal troglodytes and Daqsur, of which we drop an inventory which allowed us to count more than 100. So this vernacular architecture uses local building materials, wrought or processed stone, tree trunk, sand extraction, and locally produced lime and gypsum. No import of materials. So these elements are used as much for the construction as the interior or to obtain furniture. Concerning the intangible heritage, the main components are essentially pottery and weaving, feminine skills that share with tattoo the graphic repertoire found in architecture. This feminine know-how is another fact of good management and optimizing of resource, whatever for weaving, which provide both blankets and clothing, or for pottery, women use natural products, wool of their flocks, the colors extracted from some plants or fruit, the loom made with tree trunk, a baking oven dug in earth for pottery. Civil rites and ceremonies that accompany important moments in the life of the individual within his community, such marriage, birth, coming of age, and language. But currently we don't have an official number of Berber speakers in Tunisia, unfortunately. So practice linked to agriculture show how know-how that has been able to adapt to nature in terms of water management, which remain one of the rarest resources. They were able to control the circulation of rainwater by inventing the system of Jusur and Tabia. This is what you can see here. So, which optimize the torrential rains that cross the area to conserve as much as possible the source for their olive trees and occasionally be able to sow cereals. So because the region which occupies about a third of the national territory is geography made up of three large areas, so the Zahar with an average altitude between 400 and 500 meters, a desert region. It's a desert region. The Jbal Damr, maybe I can show the other map. The Jbal Damr is the eastern. We are talking about this part of the map. So the Jbal Damr is the eastern edge of the Syrian platform. The Jbal plain is inserted between the Jbal and the coast. The area is poor in natural resources and difficult to exploit. Whether during colonial times or during independence, the region has only been very poorly integrated into economic development. Under French protectorate, it was an area under military control. Upon independence, it was seen as reflecting the country's decadence. This is how we wanted to modernize it. It must be said that it's true that the Berber have always occupied this space and that they knew how to invent a system which allowed them to adapt to a hostile environment, but the living conditions are not among the most comfortable. No water, no electricity, no nursery school or health service. Places of residence are often far from main roads and travel is difficult. This is how the region had known since the 19th century a negative migratory flow. Often the head of the family left to work in the capital or even outside the country. He did not come back until he had saved enough to support his family for a long time. But gradually, the whole family was living. This phenomenon was amplified following a certain action carried out by the state. The population were forced to leave their village since services such as school and health center were brought together closer to the roads. We even built modern houses with electricity and water to encourage this population to settle there. Several old cities, as the case of Juirat, is the village in the south and east of Tunisia, were not very far from the new built village. So this is the ancient village and this is the new one. Most of these villages were abandoned. This abandonment, which results from these governmental policies, is also due to the climatic change which undergo this zone. An arid region with Syrian climate, where the rise in temperature is felt, where the water tables are exhausted. A change in weather pattern that is leading to destabilization of social and environment conditions. And this disruption is threatening the sustainability of natural and socio-economic systems. The last population which are resistant, like the case of the village of Shnelni, will see a large part of their heritage probably lost forever. If the built heritage is being safeguarded in a state that is still occupied, the intangible heritage is being lost because many families can no longer keep the flocks or sheep or travel long distances to maintain their land. The skills of women are more threatened by a changing lifestyle that turns a natural environment that is becoming more and more hostile. Modeled pottery has disappeared, and industrial dyes have replaced natural. Often when discussing the situation of this heritage, several factors are cited. Lack of heritage policy, economically underdeveloped area, tourism, change in lifestyle, migration. All of these factors are true and real. But I think that the climate change that the territory is undergoing is an important and devastating factor as the other. Except that it acts in silence and over a long period of time, which make it the least visible for the various actors who act on this area. In in 2018, Sijnen pottery, which is a Berber pottery, was inscribed on the list of intangible cultural heritage. In 2020, the Ksur appeared on the tentative list for the World Heritage of the UNESCO. In this case, we would ask ourselves the question of the interest of such a classification, firstly for the population or for the country, if it doesn't take such a phenomenon into consideration. Climate change or the overexploitation of natural resources have a destructive impact on lifestyle that have long been able to withstand various challenges. If our goal is to demonstrate and analyze these changes, it should also serve to help this population so that they themselves become aware of these changes, and so that the policy and the commitment of the states are a commitment in favor of a change that respects the right of this population and their descendants to a future that is as serene as possible. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Naila, for this really engaging, really insightful presentation into the Berber culture and the many intangible cultural heritage manifestations that they embody. I would now like, I wonder if you can stop the share screen to allow the next presenter to get ready for their talk. I would now like to invite Cody Grote to the floor. While you get ready, I will introduce you to the audience. Cody Grote is a Kenyan Kehaka. You can correct my pronunciation later if you want. Citizen and band member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in southwestern Ontario. His research in public history covers themes of commemoration, preservation, stewardship, and revitalization of Indigenous cultural heritage by providing provincial, federal, and international bodies. He is a PhD candidate in history and has an MA in World Heritage Studies from the Iron Bridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage at the University of Birmingham, UK. Cody is an instructor at Simon Fraser University and an incoming assistant professor at Western University in London, Ontario. Thank you, Cody, very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hello, and as soon as I see other presenters, I always realize that I have forgotten to prepare a slideshow. I like just sort of talking based on my own notes, and I apologize that you won't see the great photos that other speakers like Chris and Neela shared with us, so you just get to see my face for the next 10 minutes. But I hope that I can encourage enough interest that you will go and look up photos of these interesting World Heritage sites. So hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to listen to our panel discussion on the theme of intangible heritage, disasters, and pandemics. As Alejandra has mentioned, my name is Cody Grote. I'm currently an instructor at Simon Fraser University and an incoming assistant professor in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies. I am a Kanagahaga citizen and band member of Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in southwestern Ontario, so a First Nations nation in Canada. I'm also currently the president of an organization called the Indigenous Heritage Circle, a national not-for-profit dedicated to the advancement of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis cultural heritage priorities in Canada. So a few months ago, at the beginning of this pandemic, I was invited to present at a different conference about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the UNESCO Agenda for Sustainable Development. At that point, I wasn't familiar with this agenda, but following this invitation to present, I soon began to realize that many of the guiding principles associated with Indigenous cultural heritage, including what we know as intangible cultural heritage, could also be realized through the fulfillment of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their associated 169 target goals. This past year has enhanced my understanding about the interconnectivity between Indigenous intangible cultural heritage and the dual disasters of climate change and COVID-19, both of which will be addressed in the next few minutes. Now, most discussions about cultural heritage in Canada, as with my colleagues around the world, both tangible and intangible, are based on very Western concepts of built infrastructure. Alternatively, Indigenous cultural heritage takes a more holistic approach, as seen through Neela's presentation, for example, that recognizes how Indigenous identity is intrinsically associated with the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. This understanding often minimizes the silos that exist between tangible and intangible cultural heritage, as seen through conventions like those by UNESCO. In 1992, recognizing this intersectionality, the UNESCO World Heritage Convention became the first international legal instrument to recognize and protect cultural landscapes like Chief Roy Matta's domain, which actually I believe is not inscribed as a cultural landscape, but probably can make a good case. Commemorative bodies such as the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, which is the focus of my research, in 1999 went one step farther. They developed a differentiated definition for what they referred to as Aboriginal or Indigenous cultural landscapes. These were defined in part as a place valued by Aboriginal groups because of their long and complex relationship with that land. It expresses their unity with the natural and spiritual environment. It embodies their traditional knowledge of spirits, places, land uses, and ecology. In other words, this definition of Aboriginal cultural landscapes recognized and validated the intangible values associated with a tangible landscape. Both Indigenous cultural landscapes that have been recognized as National Historic Sites of Canada and those that have been recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites can provide us with valuable insight into how culture can intersect with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, demonstrating how intangible cultural heritage can both impact and be impacted by, similar to what Chris was saying, the dual disasters of climate change and COVID-19. A notable example of this can be seen through Pimatuan-Aki, a Canadian World Heritage Site recognized by UNESCO in 2018. The name of this site means the land that gives life in the language Anishinaabemowin, and it was recognized by UNESCO as an exceptional testimony to the continuing Anishinaabe cultural tradition of Ganawandaming Gidigaman, or keeping the land. This is a cultural framework that guides the relationship between the Anishinaabe Nation in what is now Canada and their traditional territories, instructing them to honor the Creator's gifts through sustainable ways of life. This in itself aligns with Sustainable Development Goal 15, which calls for the protection, restoration, and promotion of sustainable uses for terrestrial ecosystems and sustainable management of forests. More broadly, this demonstrates some of the intersections between intangible cultural heritage and the ways that we can address the climate crisis. Another example demonstrating this interrelationship between culture and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are the Yukon ice patches in the far north of what is now Canada. These were included on Canada's UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List in 2018. Similar to Pimatuan-Aki, the Yukon ice patches are recognized as an Indigenous cultural landscape based on the symbiotic relationship between ice, animals, insects, and people for over 7,500 years. Unlike Pimatuan-Aki, the Yukon ice patches represent a very real concern faced by many Indigenous peoples. As mentioned, aspects of intangible cultural heritage and therefore aspects of Indigenous cultural heritage are intrinsically associated with our traditional territories. If global warming continues to melt northern ice patches at an unprecedented rate, many aspects of Indigenous cultural heritage will be negatively impacted. This demonstrates how Sustainable Development Goal 13 calling for nations to take urgent action to combat climate change is not just an environmental consideration. It is intrinsically associated with intangible cultural heritage as well. To conclude, I want to showcase one more intersection between intangible cultural heritage, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and demonstrate how these both relate to the dual disasters of climate change and COVID-19. Target Goal 4.7 states in part that by 2030, all learners should acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. To do this within the context of Indigenous knowledge, it is essential that we must recognize the role of elders and knowledge keepers in the transmission of culture, including what can be classified as intangible cultural heritage. As early as March 2020, organizations such as the First Peoples Cultural Council in British Columbia, Canada, began to track the loss of elders as a result of COVID-19, understanding the broader impacts that this could have on Indigenous culture well into the future. This loss can't be quantified through raw figures associated with mortality rates of Indigenous elders, as the impacts will be much more broader and multi-generational. On this concluding note, not necessarily a happy one, it can be seen that intangible cultural heritage, specifically Indigenous intangible cultural heritage, both affects and is affected by the dual disasters of climate change and COVID-19. Further, understanding Indigenous intangible cultural heritage within the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development helps us understand how fostering these aspects of heritage can address and even mitigate some of these disasters. In order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, it must be understood that collaborative approaches will be the most successful when Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous methodologies associated with our intangible cultural heritage are understood in relation to the stewardship of our traditional territories. By respecting these practices, it may be possible to achieve the overarching objective of a 2030 agenda itself, to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. And thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you very much, Cody, for what has been a very engaging presentation, even without the slides, but it does leave me really wanting to have a look at some of the Canadian sites that you have mentioned. I would now like to invite Catalina Ortiz to join the floor. I will introduce you while you get ready. Catalina Ortiz holds a PhD in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago as a Fulbright scholar. She's an associate professor in the Bartlett Development Planning Unit of the University College London. Her research includes the negotiated co-production of space in global south cities around urban design, strategic spatial planning, and urban policy mobility practices. She uses decolonial and critical urban theory through urban knowledge co-production methodologies to study the politics of space production to foster spatial and epistemic justice. Thank you very much, Catalina, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a very hard act to follow. I really enjoyed Cody's presentation and a lot of my colleagues. So I'm just gonna, let me see, the computer is acting weird. So I think I'm gonna be moving a little bit the discussion because I'm gonna be presenting and coming from a different, let's say, expertise. And I think I'm very inspired by the whole discussion about critical living heritage. So I have been trying to make my own interpretation with colleagues and partners of how we can use actually this idea of living heritage to actually rethink the future of the so-called informal neighborhoods. So what I'm going to be walking you through today is a recent process of how can even we work together under the pandemic circumstances. So my presentation is going to be in a different way, and also acknowledge that this work has been done with my partners and colleagues in Colombia, and therefore all what I'm presenting belong to all of us. I'm just going to be sharing a collective project. And in a way, the key question that I would like to pose here, and I know that most of you have been referring to these exceptional places of exceptional beauty and historical relevance, but rather I would like to think how to frame informal neighborhoods as the living heritage of our cities. What if we change the perspective in understanding how the built environment that ordinary city can be considered as living heritage? And particularly, my work has been delving into a singular, let's say, sociocultural practice in the context of Colombian cities called convites. The convites are the practices of neighborhood upgrading through cooking and promoting collective action for actually building the neighborhood. So it's how people actually create their own places, and these spaces of solidarity and the creation of infrastructures of care are particularly the key values that are sustaining, are creating the cities, but also are sustaining citizens in these very complicated times. So reading from the colonial perspective, I would say, along with some of my colleagues, particularly from South Africa, that these convites become what Tanya Winkler has called resistant text. These resist dominant narratives in ways that they are unfamiliar or entirely foreign to the untrained eye. They resemble a form of epistemic disobedience that produces an uncomfortable and oft acknowledged incompetence. And I'm very interested in these processes of the convite, how people get together and make a common life possible. And particularly during the pandemic, in the work that we've been doing, trying to map how civil society has responded to the pandemic, is the presence of women in public space, or these practices of the ollas comunes that in Chile have been very present as well, that have been sustaining and keep sustaining and become kind of the beacon of solidarity of communities. And I think this is the intangible heritage that oftentimes is deemed as something that is not important, but I think is particularly the place where any recovery phase needs to be thought and put at the center. So I'm very inspired by popular education that has been central in the Constitution and its understanding the production of knowledge, let's say, from the ground up. And in that regard, my work has been trying to look at how particularly storytelling and stories need to be recentered in a way as a means to reach as an exercise of epistemic justice. So the intangible heritage, in a way, lies as well in those urban stories and all this network of storytellers. And that's why I'm very interested in exploring different critical urban pedagogies that can help us to leverage visual, digital, and performative storytelling. So in my work, I've been trying to constitute and expand what we call a network of urban storytellers. And it's through the collaboration of multiple organizations from different kinds in a constellation of very asymmetric power that have been working with me precisely to understand how we can learn from each other and how we need an alliance across actors to actually improve the living conditions of these places. So the work that we have done, particularly during the pandemic, is building on a diaspora of communities of practice. And what we've been trying to foster is particularly an intergenerational learning space. Last year, with people based in 13 countries, we managed to engage in a process of co-design of what we agreed to be an atlas of living heritage of a particular neighborhood in the city of Medellin in Colombia. And what some of our
partners, and particularly community leaders, that they call themselves actually the living heritage of the place. They say that it was finally a space where all were equal, at least equally occupying these squares that now we all live in, so giving some sort of different ground. And drawing from the literature on living heritage, we work under a common framework, and we try to understand these premises of how to trace the continuity of social processes and cultural responses, and trying to adapt to the conditions of the particular neighborhood that we were working with, that is called Moravia. So we were looking at the systems of care, and care understood in a more feminist approach, as well as the issues of memory and migrations. Understanding that most of the popular neighborhoods or informal neighborhoods are in a way created through successive waves of migration due to either disasters or other causes. In terms of understanding use, we focus in landscapes of recycling, so a different perspective of the cultural landscapes, if you will, and putting at the center as well ideas about community communications as a way to understand or tackle community connections. And we use, as I said, different methods as a co-creation, storytelling, and urban pedagogy. But of course, what we are experiencing here, and that in a way becomes also some limitation in understanding and fully grasping the intangible qualities and values of the places that we engage with. We are living this moment of social deprivation, and of course acknowledging the digital inequalities that have been very apparent. Nonetheless, what we try to create in these processes and exercises of co-design is trying to imagine or reimagine pedagogies to foster new infrastructures of care. So even these conditions, despite this condition, all the gathering that we had through several weeks, some of our community leaders and partners said that we hope to give you a sun hug with the body, the soul, and the heart. And I think you can still foster this connection despite of the limitation. So I think through digital co-creation and trying to trace the lively practices, we created new affective cartographies. And as we were discussing perhaps before starting, we always find ways to try to be in touch and in connection with each other, even in these different formats. And I think what was at the core of tracing living heritage and trying to learn from it was the stories of individuals, practices, and places. So in this pandemic, what we ended up doing, in words of one of our other community leaders, is that we ended up having a conversation with the territory, focusing on the stories and trying to kind of learn to listen better to these stories. But for us, it was also very important to try to visualize how is the territorial memory of the places, and how can we, using that knowledge, try to think the future transformation of a place. So moving away from preservation or static understanding of a place, but also using the values encountered in these practices as part of the tool to reimagine also the future of the place. So the focus of popular practices acknowledge trying to understand how community organizes itself, how deals with recycling processes, given that this neighborhood in particular was born out of one of the waste sites of the city. And something interesting that was also part of our process was precisely trying to put together what we call a reparative glossary. And I think that dimension of what are the places and the key words that also try to threaten the existence and the dignity, and in a way further the stigmatization of these places, was one of the very important parts of our work. So we try to build together what in collective we call a reparative glossary. And part of these pedagogies that we engage with, I have called a distributed public engagement. So through the use of community media, urban journalism, and collaborative platforms, the work, the findings, the ideas, but also the struggles and the political claims that our partners have. We've been using different formats and mediums to actually connect and engage with an audience that otherwise would have been impossible to reach out. And particularly these times, I think the role of community media is absolutely essential and have been very, very important in order to address the pandemic. And finally, I think the element of political incidence is very important. We tend to repoliticize the processes around heritage, but I think this is something that is very at the core of what we do. And I think something that we ended up in a way building upon is trying to define how these values encounter and how these premises and tenets derived from the work also inform what has been a roadmap for the region and how these have been backed up by the main organizations that work in habitat and housing. We don't have time to see this song, but I just wanted to leave because I know we have very, very short time. With the other disaster that we are experiencing, and this is a disaster that is happening as we speak, and this is also another disaster on top of the pandemic. And I think the next frontier that we need to all think about is how precisely those networks of solidarity and care need to be used, amplified, rethought, and supported to actually change one of the most pressing, damaging disasters of our world that is here in Colombia, but is also across the world, and is the militarization of our lives and our thinking. And I think we all should be standing against it and also use our work to denounce these atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you, Catalina, for bringing in some very relevant and necessary aspects of intangible cultural heritage, which are related to living heritage, and your presentation perfectly complements what we have seen we had previously seen in the session, and thank you also for bringing up the present challenge that Colombia is sadly facing at the moment, and I would like from here to send our support to the Colombian citizen. Well, this brings the presentations to an end, and I'm happy to move on to the panel discussion. I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to pose questions to our panel members. Please do so either by raising your hand, and I will pass on the word to you in due course, or by typing your questions on the chat box. Before we start with questions, I would like to give the opportunity to the panel members to provide any feedback or any reflections on the presentations that they have seen. If there's no burning feedback, then I shall move on to asking particular questions, and I would like to get the conversation started by reflecting on something that I think all of the presentations have touched on, and is to a certain extent some dynamism in the concept of intangible cultural heritage, and the fact that the narrative around it is not always evident for everybody, and therefore how relevant efforts to bring up this narrative can be. I would like to ask you if you could comment on this topic from the experience of the case studies that you have presented, or from other aspects in your work. If you could reflect on the role that highlighting or raising awareness about intangible cultural heritage has in fostering it and in protecting it in the context of disasters. Cody, would you like to take the question? Thank you.
Sure, I'll open the floor for us to get us started. I think one thing that's interesting about your question, and I would be interested to hear comparisons from colleagues around the world, is Canada is one of the few countries that has not ratified the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. So Canada has never ratified that document, so we don't participate in that list. And there's a lot of conflicting opinions as to why Canada has never done that. From an Indigenous perspective, there is speculation about how certain aspects of intangible cultural heritage, if they were preserved on this list, could have an impact for Canada's treaty obligations and protecting inherent Indigenous rights in regards to land use, resource extraction, sovereignty of traditional territories, for instance. So that's an ongoing discussion. But there's also the very conflicting or alternative topic about Quebecois in Canada, French-Canadian nationalism, and how the Intangible Cultural Heritage List might facilitate those discussions of French-Canadian nationalism and sovereignty, which is still an issue that's ongoing as well. So I think that's really interesting that for my presentation, I've looked at it in the sense of the World Heritage Convention, these intangible values. But again, we have never ratified that convention, and there's a lot of doors that could be opened or reasons why they might have been closed that are worth discussing as well in the future. But again, that's sort of my contribution to that.
Thank you very much, Cody. I wonder if maybe Naila could contribute. What is the experience from Berber heritage and in the context of Tunisia? Is dissemination and the promotion or dissemination of the narratives playing a role in its protection? Is it currently receiving attention? What is the situation?
So maybe I haven't the time to present this point in my presentation, but we can obviously observe a turning point about paying attention to the Berber heritage after the crisis of 2011. If we are calling the event of the big political change, because it's offer a chance for freedom for these people, because the question of Berber was something forbidden and not allowed to be discussed in the public sphere and even in the private sphere. So yes, Tunisia was never seen as a country with tangible or intangible Berber. For the officials, Berber doesn't exist in Tunisia. So just when what we call the revolution have been in Tunisia, I can say that even Tunisian people discovered that Berber heritage exists in Tunisia. So and this is because of this event. That's why you have now as I present the pottery of Sajned. classified as intangible heritage since 2018, and in this in the same line, we have the tentative to inscribe the Ksur in the representative indicative list of the UNESCO. But personally, I don't think that it will be accepted, because it's very difficult to make it in to protect such a big area and without thinking about the population, without thinking about climate change, that is, without thinking about the migration and many other problems. The objective is not to just to say we have classified and to hire this in every places, but that to have a real plan to make it sustainable for the population, and to take to give an opportunity for all the area to be part of the project, and to be proud to participate, to have maybe such initiative like Catalina presented in Colombia. It's very interesting, and this is it will be a beautiful thing. I think. I hope that I answered your.
Thank you, Nayla. That's really interesting to hear that there have been so many changes over the last decade with regards to data heritage in Tunisia. Catalina, in your presentation, you've discussed a lot about raising, or highlighting this living heritage, making it more visible and fostering it. I wonder if you could comment a little further on this.
Yeah, maybe the point that I was doing there in terms of how we engage with different audiences and publics, and how through my interest working with creative collectives and transmedia storytelling, I think that is one of the methodological strategies that we are trying to push forward to actually make visible and put in the public debate these issues, and trying to change the narrative about places that are usually stigmatized and therefore lacking investment. So I think for us, the pedagogical aspect of it is very central. And I think that change of consciousness in a way is very important.
I think it's really interesting how, in spite of being seemingly very different contexts, some of the things that you're all talking about are really strongly connected. Chris, I wonder if you would like to add anything to the discussion at this stage.
Sure, of course. I think the general point that I was trying to make, which is that despite having the highest degree of natural hazard risk of any country in the world, Vanuatu suffers a remarkably low mortality, and it does so through ICH. It does so through community knowledge, vernacular forms of knowledge. The problem with trying to harness these in the form of ICH lists or to codify them is that they are webs of knowledge. They're extremely difficult to pin down, to codify, to create lists of. And so UNESCO's lists of ICH tend to focus on nicely segregated performances, music, dance, whatever, that can be discreetly identified and therefore listed. And yet when you look at something like the knowledge that helps people to survive disasters, whatever disaster, militarization, cyclone, it's woven through kinship, through gender relations, through all sorts of things that don't lend themselves to being constructed as a intellectual discipline or a body of knowledge that disaster managers can simply hook into to download the wisdom of indigenous people on disaster risk reduction. It's not out there, it's not available in that form. It requires an immersion in the way that people talk and engage with the landscape and with each other. And as I've suggested, things like ancient settlement locations, which are over time, in fact, unconscious forms of ICH. Nobody thinks I'm here because I'm dodging cyclones. They think I'm here because this is where my ancestors have been. And yet that's a sedimented 3,000-year history of very careful site selection. So I'm fascinated by the way in which both conscious and unconscious and articulated and unarticulated forms of ICH coalesce to create strategies of disaster risk reduction, which we recognize retrospectively as effective, but which constantly elude our attempts to document them, pin them down. And I think that's fantastic too. I think the moment at which we start to codify and create lists of, effective ICH for disaster risk reduction is the point at which we invite their misappropriation and misuse.
Thank you for a very interesting and very rich answer. I think there's a lot of things there. One question that comes up from it before I pass on to Umberto, would you say that in that that UNESCO's definition of intangible cultural heritage and the classification that it proposes, do you think it helps in any way? Or on the contrary, do you think it makes the study of intangible cultural heritage, that it becomes a hurdle in the study of intangible cultural heritage?
Of course it helps, or it can help. ICH was the necessary corollary to World Heritage. And having got off on that tangent, we had to have something like ICH. The problem is that, of course, they're utterly woven together and integrated and should never have been separated in the first place. I can't conceive, in fact, of any World Heritage site that is not a cultural landscape. They should all be reclassified as cultural landscapes. What an ICH perspective on World Heritage does, I think, is also introduce the centrality of livelihoods. The fact that World Heritage is not sustained through the knowledge that renders it meaningful, which is the ICH, without a population that has adequate health, education, employment, and all these other kinds of mainstays of basic life. So having started working on a World Heritage site in Vanuatu, we were led to ICH and ultimately to livelihoods and to the management of tourism businesses, local tourism businesses, essential to our understanding of what it takes to transmit cultural heritage in perpetuity, which is what World Heritage is supposed to do. And yet, if it does not focus on local livelihoods, the ICH and the World Heritage are doomed. So I think it's been a really useful progression. I don't think we've got there yet. And I think what it requires us to do is to unpick the boundaries that separate the different forms of heritage convention and use them to interrogate each other in really productive ways. I'm sure everyone else has got answers to that question too.
Would anyone else want to answer before we move on to Umberto's question? Cody, please.
I know a lot of what Chris was saying, very relevant to the Canadian context. You know, with intangible cultural heritage, the desire to quantify something specific is so non-relevant to a lot of Indigenous nations and their cultural practices because, as Chris said, it's not easily quantifiable. It's so interconnected, these practices and ways of knowing. cultural landscapes does a better job of highlighting the tangible and intangible relationship. But as I said in my first comment, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention hasn't been ratified, but then also there's not really a big push to have it ratified either. It could be a useful tool if it was there. I think is kind of similar to what Chris was saying at one point, but as well, it's not necessarily reflective at all of actual on-the-ground values and ways of knowing and heritage. So I think there's a lot of interesting similarities between those two contexts.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists? Otherwise, I would like to invite Umberto to participate.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you all for the presentation. I would like to go deeper in the issue that Chris put on the table. It's related with the distance between heritage and institutionality of heritage. In terms, if we consider UNESCO, but also in the state part and the way in which the state part maintains or propose conservation from heritage. And in that sense, if we consider that the intangible heritage is related normally with living heritage, involving people and communities in this complex and big issue. If we consider that the disaster and pandemics, it's affect really directly people. People die, and when they die, we lost heritage. Not only with earthquakes or tsunami, but if we consider that people are really fragile and exposed to all these pandemics, sickness or disasters, and if we consider that in relation of that institutionality of heritage normally are much interested to conserve or to dedicate budget for restoration of buildings. And if we compare the budget of the state part in maintenance of tangible heritage is much bigger than intangible heritage. That difference is quite crazy because we are conserving, we are maintaining buildings for people, but we are not protecting people. If we consider that people are our heritage, the first and most important dimension of heritage, the relationship should be inverse. What you can say about this in your countries, in your what's happened about that? The relationship between tangible and intangible heritage and the budget dedicated to maintain and conservation of that two different kinds of heritage.
Thank you, Umberto. Who would like to take this question first? Naila? Thank you.
I think the question is very interesting, but because I share the same point of view, because here in Tunisia we have heard from the colonial period a big interest for the monumental heritage, the Roman heritage. So we conserved and preserved what was perceived for the French protectorate as a representation of their past. But when and if you can say it was a little logical, but when we in Tunisia became independent, unfortunately we continued this practice, and for 50 years we have just give priority to tangible heritage. And in these 15 years, we lost a lot of our intangible heritage because the question was not seen as relevant or as important. And now for in music or in oral heritage, or even for food, even for things that seems normal, we have lost a lot because we didn't make documentation, and even the university didn't, as I say, play the role that it was supposed of academic and researcher to do to preserve the human and to preserve intangible heritage. So now we are another point that we are very influenced by the international budget that are supporting this kind of initiative. So what we do, and I mean, politicals do that, unfortunately, we are looking for the budget, but not just to be related with the money that comes from tourism and related to what we have as World Heritage Sites. But as I say before, in the 10 last decades, we have really interesting social society initiatives that are making pressure on the government to make better things, if I can say. So I agree that we have to put more budget and more money to conserve. Or to find the way to conserve, because yes, with every people, with every aged people that we lost a part of our intangible heritage. That is, I think that for me, I don't make the difference between intangible and tangible heritage, because I think that they are tangible heritage is nothing without intangible heritage. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Please, Cody.
I actually want to comment on a comment in the chat, if that's okay, from Muriel. It's really interesting to see her comment about the World Heritage List. I agree, and I'll build on in a second, is an elitist attempt to list the best of the best, whereas the list of representative and tangible heritage knows no hierarchy. And I think the example I use when discussing World Heritage Sites to my students or in other things is that in Canada, to become a World Heritage Site, if you actually make it on the tentative list, it's 10 years and $250,000, because it takes 10 years to kind of get from a tentative list to actually being inscribed if you make it that far, knowing that we get about one designation a year that makes it for full consideration. And again, $250,000 to prepare your tentative list, your nomination dossier. It's very elitist, it's very exclusive for a lot of communities. Indigenous nations don't have the time or resources to put their sites on the list. So I agree. But again, this idea that the Intangible Cultural Heritage List doesn't have the same hierarchy is something that I disagree with, because, for example, Canada has never ratified it. There's still those gatekeepers that exist diplomatically that are preventing certain groups, certain Indigenous nations in this context from having the ability to even engage with that convention, with that list. That hierarchy exists in that capacity. And again, there's still going to be those stakeholder groups who serve as gatekeepers and decide which cases actually have the chance of being designated in this register. So there's still that idea of it being representative list. There's still those gatekeepers who very often aren't the Indigenous nations who are deciding what constitutes representativeness. So I think there's still I think both of them are elitist in that regard. So that's sort of my feedback on Marielle's comment.
Thank you. Would any other comments to join this line of discussion?
Yes, Alejandra, Chris. Look, I think Cody's on the mark there. I think all of these processes are inherently elitist. The reason I like the cultural landscape concept so much is because I think it's both physically and socially more inclusive. It just forces us to look away from the sites and start noticing what's happening around the landscape and the different kinds of relationships that are embedded in the landscape. And of course, it's almost impossible then to draw a boundary around the landscape. One of our more furious discussions with UNESCO over that Vanuatu site was about where boundaries should be. And this was, because this was a process led by the indigenous community, this nomination, that took an awful lot of translation between what UNESCO thought they might want and what the community was prepared to concede and what they understood by boundaries anyway. So I see in all of these processes all sorts of promise and possibility. I think that we just have to mix the metaphor to push that boundary even further, as this indigenous community in Vanuatu did, and constantly insist on what they saw as, it's too complicated to explain here, but a complete change in perspective, a kind of figure ground reversal in the way that the landscape was seen. So as archaeologists, my wife and I came in thinking about sites, and we left finally understanding that it's not the view from the site, it's the view from the community towards the site that is the perspective of the narration of the meaning of the site. And so what mattered was not this kind of visual watershed from the site looking out, but the view from the communities looking across to this island with a burial on it. And in a sense, it wasn't about maintaining a pristine landscape all around it. It was about maintaining the capacity of the community to tell stories looking across at that island. Sorry, that's very elaborate, but yeah, I'll stop there. I'll come back. I've got more to say.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Please, Cody.
Again, I'm going to build off Marielle's excellent and kind of insightful comments and what Chris was saying about the cultural landscape idea. And I'm going to try to tie it into our theme of intangible heritage and disasters, but perhaps giving a bit of a more deep and philosophical analysis than I normally would in a situation like this. But the idea of cultural landscapes and recognizing more of the intangible values associated with the tangible landscape solves a lot of problems that exist, or could solve a lot of problems that exist with the implementation of a World Heritage Convention that have happened. For example, in Canada, the Rocky Mountains are recognized as a World Heritage Site, but they're a natural World Heritage Site. And when the outstanding universal value criteria were originally designated, it was all about this the natural values associated with it, the landscape, the species that are involved. And when that was drafted as a natural World Heritage Site, it entirely erased the millennia of Indigenous occupancy of most territories, Indigenous land use associated with that site. And the problem with doing that is now when they're doing reviews to assure that the outstanding universal value is being preserved, it continues to exclude Indigenous nations from these traditional territories as long as it happens. If that was a cultural landscape, you could have probably included those Indigenous values, but the Rocky Mountains National Parks are one of the first World Heritage Sites in Canada in the 80s, and that didn't exist. There's a lot of pushback in Canada against changing this designation to a cultural landscape, because that would require an entirely new nomination to the World Heritage Convention. Because there's not really a clear amendment process in the World Heritage Convention. And there's a lot of risk about doing that because perhaps, it's a long process. We can't include another site. There's a lot of money associated with extending that. So there's a lot of problems and pushback. So again, you look at, I guess this disaster of colonialism, I guess is what you could say, because again, the World Heritage Convention has sort of authorized validated these narratives of sort of vast wilderness, empty landscapes that Canada's built itself on, these narratives that Canada built itself on. the World Heritage Convention authorized those by commemorating things. Most of our World Heritage sites are natural sites that also specifically align with the boundaries of our national parks. So Wood Bison National Park is a World Heritage Site. It's the exact boundaries of one of our national parks, and it's all built on these narratives of vast open spaces that need to be preserved. And again, in all of those national parks, there were indigenous nations that were displaced. So, cultural landscapes could address that idea of colonialism if they recognize the intangible values, the associations between the nations in those territories, but that's not going to happen because it's too difficult, too expensive to go back and address those past designations. So that's just sort of a rant building off of Marielle's comments and Chris's comments.
Thank you, Cody. And I think you're touching on, again, on an important element, which is the effort and the commitment that there has to be from different actors to push for a World Heritage Site nomination, which necessarily is going to mean that many sites and many forms of heritage are always going to be left out of these recognitions. And that's a particular area that I'm interested in, what happens to undesignated heritage, and in particular in the context of disasters. Who thinks about that? And going back to Humberto's question, if it's already if intangible heritage that is well recognized is already discriminated against in context of disasters, what happens with unrecognized intangible heritage, and all of these human elements that are really at the core of our modern understanding of heritage. What is heritage without people? And if these relationships are not well understood or are not well recognized, how can we manage them in these contexts? What can we do in this context? And that's actually a question that I wanted to pose to the panel. What could we do in order to account for intangible heritage in context of disasters, be it perhaps to mobilize it or to allow its mobilization rather than perhaps hindering it through the processes of recovery or intervention after disasters? What steps, if any, do you think we could take to have intangible cultural heritage play a role in recovery?
Yeah, Alejandra, I can start tackling that. I mean, nowhere is this more clear than in the post-disaster needs assessment, PDNA process, which is the global framework for assessing the largely economic impact of a disaster. It's done within weeks or at most a month after a disaster hits, and you get a nice PDNA report. They started in 2008. It wasn't until 2013 there was a chapter for culture, and most of that is, of course, a focus on tangible heritage, and usually buildings, prominent buildings, not vernacular built heritage. So the challenge of working out how ICH might find a role in that post-disaster needs assessment process really focuses minds. And what it's made quite apparent is that you can't do this in a hurry after a disaster. You have to have those voices already being listened to in advance of disasters. This is part of the preparedness phase of the disaster cycle, is actually having those channels of communication open and voices being heard from amongst local or vernacular communities about how they manage disasters at a local level. They're the people who know the landscape, who know the ground, who know how floods play out in a particular barangay in Manila, and there is no substitute for that expertise, but you can't do it retrospectively. So what it calls for is enormous process, and this is where the funding is important. The question earlier about where's the funding for ICH? Yeah, truly a huge challenge. But if we can't do it for the areas that we know are exposed to repeated disasters, like in the Philippines with cyclone, work with the communities that you see being hit every time, and that have that knowledge in place, and learn themselves each time from successive cyclones. But those channels of communication have to be in place prior to the disaster. And one other thing, just because I'm talking, and because it's after midnight here, is just the restorative potential of ICH, the remarkable potential of ICH to do things that no one has anticipated in the process of recovery, in the process of restoring lives and communities. And so we're constantly trying to catch up with what ICH actually does in real life. I'm particularly fascinated by the role of dream, by the way in which people use dream to return to the past, to engage with ancestors, to ask questions, and to bring back forms of knowledge, to reawaken forms of knowledge that for them are ancestral. To an outsider, they might seem like the product of somebody's dream, but they're not. And then they become real because people act on the basis of that dream. Okay? So whatever you think about the ontological status of dream, it has material consequences. So where's our study of dream and disaster?
Thank you very much, Bruce. Catalina, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm the non-expert here, so I can speak from ignorance, and I'm fine with it. I think I have issues, and maybe it's connected to what Humberto is writing on the chat. And I think the question that I don't have any steps like 1, 2, 3 because I don't believe in formulas, but I could suggest what is who we need to look recognition for? Who needs to recognize those processes? Is it always UNESCO? Does it even UNESCO have budget for anything? Is it helpful? I don't know. But I don't think, at least in the realities that I work with, never ever I have seen any positive comment about them. Is it the local organization, the local state? Maybe. But again, I'm really resonate with Chris, Neil, and Cody's words around livelihoods. And I think if it's not connected to livelihoods and like a broader perspective of how to actually support collective life, then I don't think it's very relevant, right? And the other thing is about legitimization. Whose knowledge count? Who decides what knowledge count? And I think in these discussions about decolonization, it also poses a big question on our role and researchers and universities, and who's entitled to actually say what knowledge counts. And I think there are open questions also to understand how this intangible heritage work, and who's valuing what and for what purposes. And I think in the case of these different disasters, the pandemic has shown that usually it's not necessarily the state that operates there, and are more horizontal networks of support that are at stake. So I wonder what is the role of self-governing mechanisms, autonomy and sovereignty of the different collectives regarding what that intangible heritage is and what can do. So are more questions rather than answers, but I just wanted to pick up on that, like not taking for granted the recognition and the legitimacy of the current bodies that actually are the self-guarding or the gatekeepers of what is so-called heritage, which I don't think has the legitimacy everywhere to operate.
Thank you for that comment, and I thoroughly agree with you. But I would like to add that in many contexts, convincing the donors can go a long way towards action, in the sense that obviously it depends on the context. But my experience in some post-disaster contexts is that donors have an enormous capacity to decide where the efforts go. Would anyone else want to comment on this? I think so there are a number of tools that are well established in international practice, and post-disaster needs assessment that Chris was mentioning is certainly one of them. And I think we shouldn't. And I really enjoyed hearing a reflection from Cody about the SDGs earlier. It is true that we have seen some important changes in the last decade about the role or the consideration of culture and heritage in the international policy that is in a way, in many ways, having significance in what takes place throughout the world. And finally, the SDGs, as opposed to the Millennium Development Goals, they mention culture and heritage. And the same-day framework for disaster risk reduction also mentions culture and heritage as opposed to the previous framework. And these are definitely steps that are very, very positive, but probably not yet. There's probably still a lot of work to be done. I wonder if there are any other questions from the audience. We've got a few members of the audience. Would anyone like to come in for a question or with a contribution as well from your own experience? We still have another 10 minutes for discussion. If anyone would like to contribute also from the audience.
Alejandra, maybe if we don't have any new suggestion, we can give the floor to the presenter today, to the presenter, and then we can close if you want.
Perfect, we can do that. So I would like to give the floor to the 4 panel members for any final comments that they would like to make about today's session. Maybe we could take your comments in the same order as presentations, and could I possibly ask Chris to start?
Sure. I mean, you know, there's been some pessimism expressed about the capacity of UNESCO to put food in bellies. And I think you could die waiting for that to happen. But at the same time, it's an incredibly important forum, and words matter and definitions matter. And, you know, the precise wording of Hyogo and Sendai and the various conventions are critical. They do have weight. So I think this is, again, one of those arenas where you work on all fronts simultaneously. You never lose sight of the fact that on the ground, certain things need to happen and will not wait for UNESCO to make a decision about them, while at the same time, you do need to be continuing that fight. I would love to see Canada reopen the question of the cultural landscape and Rocky Mountains. If it can work for Uluru Katajuta and Tongariro in New Zealand, I can't imagine why. And it's obviously a conversation that needs to happen. So that's why all of us here are engaged with the conventions, because we do have a sense that actually the precise definitions and the words matter. They carry weight.
Thank you very much, Chris. Nayla, would you like to make any final comments?
Yes, maybe to continue with what we have been saying. So I think that we can criticize the UNESCO Convention, but I think that this is it gives opportunity and tools to I prefer to say autochthon people to make some pressure on the national government and national policy to recognize their rights and to put them in front of the duty of their duty to respect the diversity in the national area. And as I think Chris said, yes, we are here because we still believe that thanks to this kind of convention, the UNESCO, or maybe a regional convention or other sort of convention, people have learned about their rights and have some arguments, are awareness about their, I can say, problems, and they can make the change with the UNESCO Convention and to ameliorate this convention.
Thank you very much, Naila. Cody, would you like to take some final words?
My final words are just that I think it's 1 a.m. in Australia, so I think Chris has done an exceptional job sharing these deep insights for it being well past midnight. But anyway, I've enjoyed meeting all my colleagues from around the world, and I think it's interesting to see the similarities, more similarities than differences exist between all of these international contexts, which I think is something that is worth recognizing in itself. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And finally, Catalina.
Yeah, so now I'm going to turn to a more positive light. I've been interested in intangible heritage and more in living heritage because it's the potential it carries. And I also believe, like Chris, that words matter, and that's why all our work around the glossary has been very important. But more than that, I think that the power it has is that can be a leverage tool to actually negotiate across scales. And in that regard, that's the same use we do of the SDGs or any other, global, either conventional global agenda. And I think if we frame these ideas of living heritage, it has a lot of potential to actually mobilize political interest across scales, from the very local embedded communities that actually need also to amplify and recognize most of the times the values that they carry, to actually go all the way to the international arena to make the connections that are needed to mobilize support and hopefully budget to create better living conditions, because after all, whatever tool we use is to actually preserve, protect, and dignify collective lives in any of the sites that they are taking place.
Indeed, Catalina. And I would like to thank the panel members first for joining, for taking part in this event, for agreeing to present, and for the rich, insightful, and engaging presentations and the very interesting discussion that has followed. So thank you to my panel members. A big round of applause. And I would like to pass on the word to Humberto before we finish.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Thank you for your moderation and for the coordination previously on the session. And thank you to all the panelists. Your case studies, your knowledge, your experiences are very important for us and for heritage in general. Thank you especially to Chris to follow us in the early Saturday, in this early Saturday for you. And then it's the demonstration of what heritage can do for all of us. The passion, that everybody give to this important issue for our species. Thank you very much again. I would like to invite you to the session of next week. That is the final week of this One World Seminar. The next Monday we will have sustainability and future after disasters and pandemics, and it will be moderated by Karen Fried here from Chile. Thank you very much again, and follow us in the YouTube channel that we have put in the chat. And again, I hope we can see you soon in person. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.